Hey, welcome to the Everyday Investor. My name is Darcy Ungaro. I'm sitting with Ashley Church. How are you, Ashley?
I'm good, Darcy. Nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, this is the second episode in a series of three that I will be releasing over the summer. But you would have obviously a longer point of view difference here. But as it relates to, say, countries like Canada and New Zealand, you made the comment that, hey, we're going through, well, Canada is going through a lot of the same sort of issues that New Zealand is going through. And kind of leveraging off our previous discussion that we had, maybe this is the left and the right and the wokeism and all that sort of stuff. Do you want to just kind of describe what you mean by that or unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if I look at New Zealand and Canada and indeed Australia, I mean, very similar societies for a big part of their history, very similar values, very similar cultural traditions, and in lots of respects, very similar lifestyles. Probably a bit colder in Canada, but similar lifestyles overall, and that's something to be proud of. I think New Zealand, Canada, and Australia between them make up probably three of the greatest nations on earth when it comes to lifestyle, and had done for a long time. But over the last, particularly 5 years, the 5 years that we've had the current government here in New Zealand, and I can't quite remember when Trudeau was elected, but I think it was relatively close to the time that Ardern was elected. We've seen both Canada and New Zealand go down this rabbit hole, this path of what I would call alt-left government, which is buying into this sort of this woke agenda that we talked about in the previous show. And it's impacted in both countries quite significantly on our lifestyle. You saw that big truckers revolt in Canada about a year ago, and just the reaction of the country, the strong, visceral reaction of the country to the way that they're being governed. And we've seen similar things here. We saw the parliamentary protests. So I've seen both countries, both great countries with amazing traditions, being destroyed might be too harsh a word, although it probably isn't, but certainly being taken down a path which is contrary to what the citizens of both of those nations traditionally have felt is central to the core of who we are as people, and I'm obviously concerned about it.
And do you think that from the woke viewpoint or the left or even the alt-left viewpoint, in their minds, this is progress? We're actually going somewhere. This is good. We need to fight off this extremism. And the extremism
it's a good question, actually, because I have wondered in the past what the ultimate goal is for the alt left, and because we know what it is with the right. It's about, well, if I'm to be blunt, it's about preparing society for God, because that's where most of the tradition of that those societies have come from. I don't really understand where it is with the woke, because there is no ultimate objective. There is no nirvana that you reach, and it's more about the here and now. It's more about appreciating and recognizing and respecting each person's differences. And I don't know what that means you end up as. It means you end up as a society where you've got enormous diversity, for want of a better word, but where it's meaningless, where it leads to nothing. In the process of being progressive and improving our societies, it's actually deprogressive. That's not a word, I just made it up, but it's about taking societies backwards, because ultimately you end up with a society that has no values, that doesn't believe in anything. And it's interesting, Darcy, because I think sometimes about, not that I'm advocating war, but I think what would have happened if we'd had a woke movement during the Second World War, because people would have said, well, I'm not, I don't believe in the sorts of things that the West was fighting for, in terms of fighting Hitler and fighting Nazism, and so I don't want any part of your war. I suspect we probably would have rolled over and been beaten, because the sorts of things that powered that society and actually made people stand up as one and say, how are we going to reject this because it's not who we are? A lot of that doesn't exist anymore, or it certainly doesn't exist on the left of the agenda.
Do you feel like that makes us vulnerable?
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally vulnerable. The only caveat to that, the only saving grace, is that everybody else is doing it too. so even in the countries that we would traditionally have regarded as enemies, the same thing's going on there, albeit to a lesser degree. But yeah, it does worry me, because it means that we're vulnerable to somebody coming in, or an authoritarian power coming in at some stage in the future, where there's no counterbalance to that, where we don't have an agreed view, we don't have agreed values, and therefore, how do you fight it?
Yeah. So one of the things that I kind of do when I'm preparing for these podcasts is and a lot of the stuff that I cover, it will be kind of like macro stuff lately, especially in the last 6 months. I've really been digging deep into, hey, why do things work like this? Why do interest rates go up like this? Why do we have cycles? And just thinking about demographics, all that sort of stuff. And when I go there, it's not that hard to kind of go down a mainstream path of thought, because there's a lot of content. There's a lot of really smart people in there. It's well trodden. But every now and then I'll go off in the weeds just to kind of really just explore every alternative viewpoint. And I do this with all my thinking. It's always, what are the both sides of this? And sometimes I'll bump up against some pretty dark narratives, which just seem ridiculous by all accounts. And we now have a name for that. It's a conspiracy theory, apparently. But in this new world that we're living in, with this new form of newspeak, I guess you could say, it's really hard to know what words mean. So for the benefit of myself, and forgive me, audience, if you're not interested in this, what is your version of what a conspiracy theory actually means?
Well, there's a few moving parts to a conspiracy theory that are important to understand, because that term's thrown around a lot. We talk about conspiracy theories, and it's almost used as a synonym now for being wacky and having strange ideas. And to be fair, in a lot of cases, that's an accurate synonym, but not always. So let me break down firstly what a conspiracy theory is. So the first thing that's important to understand to make it a conspiracy theory is it's a theory which posits that there is an alternate agenda to the one that's apparent. So a conspiracy theory says, although the government might be doing this, its real agenda is this. So it's doing this, and this is what this is designed to make you think it's going down a particular track, but the real motivation is this. It's not always about the government, it's about all sorts of groups. But so it posits that there is an alternative agenda to the one that is actually being promoted as being the reason that an action's being taken. So that's the first consideration. And then the second one is the taking of a series of facts and figures and imposing opinion on top of that and consolidating that into one package. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. Some of what comes out of conspiracy theory is based on actually pretty good data. So when you look at a lot of the conspiracy theories that make their way into social media, the data that underpins those conspiracy theories is often actually quite good. There's nothing wrong with it. And it's pointing out things about which we should be concerned. And I think, for example, of some of the stuff that was going on during COVID, where there were people who were putting an alternative narrative out there around what was actually happening, who, in terms of the data, have actually proven to be correct. They've proven to be right. It becomes a conspiracy theory, though, when the person telling that story then goes beyond the data, the empirical information that can be proven one way or the other, and adds their definition of what that means. So more people are dying from COVID who had the COVID injections, vaccinations, and that therefore means that the CIA is putting glass on the injection, whatever. So the second bit is an opinion. It's not actually a fact, it's somebody's opinion. The first bit's real, and it's the second bit that takes away the credibility and makes it into a conspiracy theory. And when I watch this stuff, I don't think conspiracists actually realize they're doing it. I think they genuinely believe that stuff, and they can't in their mind separate between the facts and the opinion that they've imposed. If they just stuck to the facts and said, this is what's happening, don't know what it means, here are some ideas about what it might mean, but you draw your conclusions, they would have more credibility. But because they don't do that, because they do impose their often wacky interpretations of what that means, they set themselves up for derision, and they invalidate the good information that they've actually brought to the public's attention by doing that.
That's a really good point, right? Because what you're basically saying is that the data is the data. It will speak what it needs to speak. And over time, that will be proven true. But when you overlay an opinion, or you conflate your opinion or viewpoint with the data, it becomes intricately, you just come across as a suspicious, paranoid.
And next time you see a conspiracy theory, Darcy, because you'll see exactly what I've just described. You'll see often really good data, nothing wrong with it, overlaid with nonsense. And it's the nonsense and so the whole thing gets brought into disrepute by the imposition of somebody's opinion to what is good information.
Okay, cool. Well, let's actually go there then. So what's your view on the origins of COVID, or any other aspect of COVID that you feel the data is saying, but we're not saying?
So once we became aware of that, and once we realized as governments that it wasn't going to be what we thought it was going to be in terms of mortality, that was the time, that was a signal to governments to say, we need to drop our restrictions, we need to go back to normal. This thing is not the big killer that we all expected it to be now that we've got empirical data. We didn't do that. In fact, New Zealand doubled down. It had another lockdown. At that point, it went beyond being a medical crisis and it became a political opportunity for the government, who thought that if they did the same thing that they'd done the previous time, given that they'd got such a strong poll result, that they would be in favour again and that they would increase their popularity. It didn't actually work. And people who started to see the contradiction between the reality and the narrative reacted to that with things like the parliamentary protest and some of the other. And you've seen the outplaying of that and the effect of that on the government's popularity in the 2 years since, which has plummeted as people have actually realised what's happened. So that was an example of a narrative versus a reality, which I think people slowly but eventually picked up on. And it's interesting because you actually referred to it in that question previously, where you said you wouldn't have said something a year ago because it would have been reacted to differently to now. That's an indication of the fact that the understanding of those things has changed over that period of time.
Right. So again, there's a lot in that. Why, firstly, though, are we so offended by what you just talked about?
I don't know that we are now. Well, you might be, but
I'm keeping it well hidden, right?
I don't know that we are. I think we might have been. When I wrote that article early this year, there was some offence to it. There was a few people picked up on it and were very defensive of the government's measures and came up with what I thought was, in my view, some irrelevancies in terms of what the government had done and what have you. But the vast majority of people, in fact, I don't think when I've talked about that in the last 3 or 4 months, even 6 months, I don't think anybody's been offended by it. I think now that that's regarded as a perfectly reasonable position. And in fact, I can't think of too many people now. Whereas a year ago, there were a lot of people defending the government's position. Now, they're few and far between. They're hard to find now.
Fascinating. They're all on LinkedIn, though, defending our fearless leader.
Are they? They don't come on my LinkedIn posts.
No, probably not in yours. No. So, and it kind of speaks to this thing, going back to where we started with the Canadian flavor, with the New Zealand flavor of politics that we've observed over the past few years. This almost like this totalitarian, it's a real strong, heavy word with a lot of negative connotations, but this totalitarianism, this I don't know, this authoritarian sort of flavor, which kind of feels like maybe it was towards the tail end of last year or this year, a real uprising and resistance to that.
Yep.
And I don't even know what to call that. Like, what would you call that uprising? Because everything has to have a name in due time, right?
Well, yeah. So firstly, the totalitarianism that you're talking about, that you're absolutely right. So prior to 2020, that New Zealand just rejected that idea of government and it just wouldn't have flown. But what was interesting was with COVID, with the first round of lockdowns, certainly leading up to that election in 2020, and there was definitely an uprising. Now, I think if we look back with an historical context on this thing in 10 years' time, I think we will see the parliamentary protests as the single event, not necessarily the first event, but the single visible event which changed the public view of this stuff. And the reason for that wasn't so much about the protest itself, because there was some wacky stuff in there. Let's be fair, there was some weird stuff taking place in there. It was like a San Francisco live-in or love-in in the 60s. But what happened, the way the government and indeed the opposition responded to it, I think was what changed the public psyche. The fact that the government called these people a river of filth, said that they weren't Kiwis, and that the leader of the opposition refused to go down and talk to them, that switched something in people's heads. And I think for every person who was at that protest, there was another 50 who weren't there, but were saying, actually, we're with you. We back you on what you're doing. Yeah. That changed the narrative, because since that time, and I'll be interested if you agree with this, since that time, the mood has changed dramatically from where we were even a year ago.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that we probably don't. Well, I guess my generation in particular, Gen X. Am I Gen X? Yeah, I'm Gen X. My generation in particular, I don't think we've actually gone through as adults something like this. And kind of my theory is that every generation will go through kind of the same sort of elements. And it's just like the rhyming of history over time. And I can absolutely pick up on that there was a distinct tipping point where those that would quietly have these views tentatively and cautiously started to share those views with those that they knew they could.
It gave them permission to change their mind.
Yeah.
The event gave them permission because if they'd had lingering doubts before, suddenly they saw 10,000 other people thinking the same way, and then suddenly it became okay to hold those alternative views.
Yeah. And like that was probably I guess the first time that I was exposed to the words, not the first time, I guess, but just really exposed to that concept of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. We used to call that deception. And I just wonder, like going back to what we were saying with the conspiracy theories, how there might be an underlying set of facts, but the opinion layer on top of that distorts that. How do we kind of separate deception from both sides? Maybe it is this authoritarianism that is speaking lies to us, and maybe the small fringe minority of voices, maybe they're trying to deceive us too. How do we actually recognize what's true?
Well, the first thing to recognize that disinformation in and of itself, not by that term, but in and of itself, has actually been around for as long as there's been dialogue between people. So the idea, and because disinformation in its simplest sense is simply saying things that aren't correct, that's called free speech. It's been around for as long as I've been alive, and you've been alive, and 300 or 400 years prior to that. So and we've survived, strangely, actually pretty well, even though there's been opinions, some of which haven't been correct, and there's people tend to be able to sift out what's right and what's wrong. What's now meant by disinformation or misinformation or malinformation or those various other terms is actually not about what's wrong and what's right. It's about the objectification of a single narrative, and that narrative can change. And that's the thing I think people have missed in this whole debate. They've thought that there's a government narrative. Well, yes, there is, but the government narrative itself can actually change. So the concept of disinformation isn't to say that there's one truth. The concept of information is to say there's one source of truth. And that's a different thing. That's a subtle but important difference. So, and you saw that when Ardern on her podium talked about the government being the single source of truth when it came to COVID. And that's the term that's come back to haunt her, but she's used that same approach in other areas, and the government has supported and I think funded the disinformation project, which has become kind of its bully boy, its whipping boy in this thing, which has promoted the idea that anything that doesn't agree with the government narrative, whether it be COVID, whether it be the economy, whether it be free speech, whether it be gender ideology, is dangerous and constitutes hate speech and needs to be closed down. That's a chilling development for a free society. Now, I'm very pleased to see that Kerry Ellen has, and I don't think it's because she's had a Damascus Road conversion on this stuff itself. I think the Law Commission basically said to her, imposing limits on free speech is going to be virtually impossible, and you won't be able to do it through legislation. So she's backed down on most of that stuff, sent it back to the Law Commission, and hopefully that'll die a natural death for another generation. But we need to be very, very concerned about this concept of disinformation, because I'll say it again because it's an important point. It's not about the narrative being a single narrative. It's about a single source of that narrative, and a single source which can change its mind. And as it changes its mind, you're expected to go along with that change of mind.
Sure. And it's strange, right? Like how we don't see this. If the single source of truth is a government which can change, yes, you may like the single source of truth today, if you're that way inclined.
Yep.
But will you really like the single source of truth tomorrow if there's a change of government and now
people don't think that way. People don't think that way. They think it's going to be there forever. So the people that believe in this stuff, the people, particularly those on the left who believe in their stuff, they don't actually think far enough ahead to think there might be a change of government. So they assume that it's whatever narrative they've got in place now is the narrative that it's always going to be. If they did exactly what you've just done and thought, hang on, we might have a national government and it might have a different view on these things, they may not be quite so determined to impose these limitations on free speech. But they're not thinking that way. They're simply looking and saying, oh, well, this is the narrative forever. Let's lock it in so that people can't disagree with it.
Okay, because like I'll ask the question anyway, but because you clarified that it's not necessarily about a single truth, it's the single source of truth. It probably makes this question kind of somewhat redundant. But going back to a different part of the conversation that we had, I think on the previous episode, alt-left, alt-right, extreme views on opposite ends of this political spectrum. If you were to choose how to die, extreme heat, extreme cold, which one is better, like alt-left or alt-right? Which one would you have to choose if there was a gun to your head? Because there might literally be a gun to your head in this example.
Oh, no, I'd be shot. no, they're as bad as each other. The alt left is probably marginally worse, but the alt right's certainly not something to go and party about either. But it's just interesting. Just one thing I will say though, because you mentioned there about the narrative changing. I'll give you an example, and you may choose to cut this because it might offend some of your listeners. But there is a concerted, and it's been around for about 20 years, but I see it's back in the starting to develop traction again at the moment. There's at the moment to normalise paedophilia, and that's still regarded as not being mainstream, as being on the extremes. But watch the space. So let's not be surprised if in 5 or 10 years' time there is a concerted move to say this is a mental condition, it's not people's fault, we shouldn't be penalising them, punishing them, they should be able to. So it's this creep of saying we've won this little battle and now we're going to take the tent post and we're going to go that little bit further out. It's that evolving or creeping narrative aspect of this ideology, which should really concern us in respect of what it means in terms of our traditional values.
Minor attracted persons, we must.
Yeah, well, that's right. Maps, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it sounds so odd, and I guess this kind of loops into another theme that I've kind of noticed with a lot of your posts on LinkedIn and a lot of the articles that you write, is that often you're drawing examples from the United States, and some of your critics, if there are many, and I'm sure there must be many, would probably say, hey, why do you focus so much on the US? Like this is New Zealand. We're completely different. So yeah, do you want to respond to that? Like why do you think it's relevant?
So the reason I use that is because it's a sort of a weird there but for the grace of God thing. So where the States are now is where I think the rest of the world will ultimately head. So there's that aspect of it first. And it's more about when I do focus it on that, it's not so much about the individual issues, it's about the divided landscape. And the divided political landscape, and oh my God, it's divided in the US at the moment and getting worse on both sides. So there's no heroes in this thing. But interesting, you should pick up on criticism because I one of the interesting trends I've seen in my LinkedIn follower numbers, they've gone up exponentially over the last 6 months, and probably 50% of that's Americans. So clearly they're not all disagreeing with it. And in fact, if you go and read some of the comments, you'll see there's a lot more now talking about stuff that's meaningless to us about the amendments and Bill of Rights and what have you. But so clearly that narrative is picking up. So what that heartens me, because it suggests to me that there's still some people in the middle of the US political landscape who are still thinking reasonably rationally and have a more balanced view, more akin to what Canadians and New Zealanders have. But that's why I just think if you want to see where we could potentially go, that's where we'll potentially end up here.
All right, and as we draw this one eventually to a conclusion here, I want to just pick up on some of the bits of points of deception that we might be getting suckered into right now here in New Zealand specifically, but maybe this comes from the US originally. What are things like war, the economy, politics, health, wealth? What are some of the areas that we should probably just be a little bit alert to? You've mentioned the minor attracted persons piece, but what else?
Oh, well, the gender thing's a big one for me, although that's an interesting one because already I think there's aspects of that have been normalised that would make my view already would be regarded as extreme. I take the view that gender's biological and there's only two, and that anything outside that is unusual. And in saying that, I'm conscious that there will be people who will be offended by that viewpoint because already that narrative around, diversity of genders has already taken hold, either because people actually believe it, or because they're scared to express a counter view. So that's an example of one where we've probably lost that fight. But some of the other areas are around and again, this won't worry everybody, but it certainly concerns me, the attack on Christianity. Whatever you think of Christianity, you may not buy into the belief system, but the fundamentals of our society, the things that make our societies strong and have driven most of the rights issues over the last couple of 100 years, almost all came out of Christianity. Women's rights, Christianity. End of slavery, Christianity. End of child labour, the way that it was being exercised in Europe in the 18th century, Christianity. All of those things changed as a result of Christian movements. And so the attempt to destroy Christianity as a political movement, if you don't agree with it as a faith movement, is another nail in a developing coffin, which is around destroying the things. It's the guy sitting on the tree looking back toward the trunk and sawing the branch off. That's a really good picture of our society at the moment. It's doing things that we think are, great at the time in terms of signaling our virtue, but will ultimately destroy the basis of the society in which we live. But in terms of other issues at the moment, there's a whole list of them, Darcy. Changes which are taking place within our education system, which is less now about the education of our children and more about the indoctrination of them. Now, people have been saying that for a long time, but there's a greater truth in it now than has ever been the case. And, and again, this is a very fuddy-duddy term, but I'll use it, the increase of perversion in society, the glorification of sex in all of its various different forms and the exposure of our children to that. And if I can use a really old-fashioned term, but it kind of sums all of this up, and this will mean different things to different people, but the term I would use is paganism. And it's the opposite. It's the counterbalance to Christianity, and it is pervasive in our society.
Okay, wow. There's a lot in that, and
maybe too much. So.
No. Maybe not enough to make this podcast under 1 hour. So we might do another episode on this one, actually, if that's
sure.
right. But
Sure.
just bringing it down to wealth, like when you're describing that kind of sitting on a tree branch and kind of sawing it off, but sitting on the wrong end of it, I kind of think of that in terms of how we're building wealth, to completely disregard the relevance of what we've talked about in this episode, or to think that this has got nothing to do with the branch that we're sitting on as we grow our wealth, in my mind, seems absolutely absurd to contemplate that. However, I kind of sense that most people are kind of thinking this has got nothing to do with investing.
Well, let me get right to the heart of that. The very basis of capitalism in a democratic society is an outpouring of a Christian society. And I know people find that hard to believe, but if you go back and think about what changed and made our societies what they are, and if I was to pick probably the key point in the last 500 years, it would be Henry VIII splitting from the Catholic Church and forming the Church of England, not for particularly altruistic motives, to be fair. He wanted to get divorced. But the impact of that on our societies over the next 500 years has been dramatic. And one of those was the granting of more and more rights to the citizenry, the taking away of power of the monarch, which happened first in the UK and then throughout Europe. The impact of that was a creation of societies where people could prosper on the toil of their own brow. And that was a very early version of what eventually became capitalist societies. So if you believe that you can move away from the Christian values that society has developed and still maintain a form of capitalism, you're kidding yourself. And people will say to me, oh, but what about China? China's got a capitalist society. Yes, it has. But that capitalist society is at the whim of the government. The government can take that away and has done from time to time over the last 50 years if it chooses to do so. They don't have the freedoms that drive capitalism in the longer term. And there are limitations and constraints around how you can develop wealth and the circumstances under which you can do it. If you want to maintain the freedoms that you've got at the moment to live in a prosperous society where you make choices about your economic future, that goes hand in hand with the value systems that our societies have developed.
Wow. Okay. Challenging, thought-provoking. This will be extremely offensive to some people, and so I'll apologize on behalf of you if you don't want to.
And I won't.
Exactly. I get it. I get what you're saying, but I also get the reaction to that, because I've seen it, and all I can say is that, again, like if you have a view, any of you in the audience are watching, if you have a view that's contrary to what Ashley is talking about, then leave a comment in the YouTube video for sure, if it makes you feel better. But it's really about you. It's really about challenging your pre-existing belief set. If it really is true and it's against this, then make sure that you can rely on that, because at some stage, either literally or figuratively, we might be forced to die on these hills of whatever we stand for, right? So yeah. Awesome, Ashley. If people want to follow your work, I'm just going to put up a picture here of your website. Awesome website, fantastic content. You can see one of them right there we were talking about today loosely. If people want to find out, ashleychurch.com, is it the best place to send people to, apart from that and your LinkedIn page?
Yeah, between that and LinkedIn, those are probably the two that are constantly being updated. There's an article goes on that website every week, and LinkedIn pretty much every time I need to scratch an itch with a view. So between those two, that's probably the most for those that want to delve into that rabbit hole. Those two.
Okay, awesome. All right, really appreciate it. Thanks very much, Ashley.
No problem. Talk to you again.
All right. Cheers.
Hello.